Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Next up is my conversation with the writer Chaya Bhuvaneswar to talk about her award-winning short story collection, White Dancing Elephants. As you'll soon discover in this conversation, even though we are primarily talking about stories and storycraft, Chaya is also a physician, a scholar of Hindu epics, and a poet. I've uploaded 2 pieces by Chaya to the bonus archive that reflect some of her other talents. One, a poem, Geese, chosen by Joy Harjo for the Cutthroat Prize, and the other, a short conversation between us about the importance of singing for her, and then she sings for us. Both of these can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, where you can learn about other benefits to becoming a supporter of the show. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer and physician Chaya Bhuvaneswar. Bhuvaneswar is a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Medical School. She's also a Rhodes Scholar who studied Indian poetic traditions and Sanskrit at Oxford. Bhuvaneswar's work has been published in Tin House, Narrative Magazine, LitHub, Electric Literature, Michigan Quarterly Review, and elsewhere. She is the recipient of a MacDowell Colony Fellowship, a Sewanee Conference Scholarship, and a Henfield Award for her writing. And she's here today to talk about her debut collection of stories, White Dancing Elephants, just out from Dzanc Books, and winner of the 2017 Dzanc Short Story Collection Prize. NPR said of White Dancing Elephants that Bhuvaneswar's unflinching about the lives of those for whom identity is a constant battle and the act of being is an unavoidable challenge, but she doesn't ignore the beauty in their strength. White Dancing Elephants is a necessary book and one that introduces a gifted voice to contemporary literature. Amelia Gray says White Dancing Elephants is a searing and complex collection, wholly realized, each piece curled around its own beating heart. Tender and incisive, Chaya Bhuvaneswar is a surgeon on the page, unflinching in her aim, unwavering in her gaze, and absolutely devastating in her prose. This is an astonishing debut. And Diana Abu-Jaber adds, filled with dark music, nuance, and intelligence, White Dancing Elephants takes readers on a thrilling journey. In sharp takes, Chaya Bhuvaneswar unfolds the complexities of race and gender, tragedy, and eros. This unforgettable collection will hold its readers captive to the very last page. Welcome to Between the Covers, Chaya Bhuvaneswar.
Thank you so much.
So in one interview, you say that if anyone had asked you during the 10 years you worked on these stories what your stories were about, you would have answered race, queerness, sex, mythologies. And in your self-interview at the Nervous Breakdown, you ask yourself to describe your collection in 4 words or less, and you say lust, revenge, betrayal, justice. So I want to start with the opening story, the story that shares the title with the collection as a whole. So tell us why you decided to both open the collection with the story White Dancing Elephants and also name the collection White Dancing Elephants.
I love those sort of questions about process because it illustrates to me how little control I really have over it. And I think I just sort of felt my way there was a little bit of defiance because I'd had a former writing teacher who's very sweet and meant this protectively, but said, well, whatever you do, don't publish White Dancing Elephants as a story because that's just too personal. And she is of a generation and grew up at a time when women were discouraged strongly from talking about miscarriage. And so I think because that title story is a piece of autofiction, and really did grow out of a moment of almost overwhelming grief that I experienced about a lost pregnancy, a lost child, I think it marked a real turning point for me as an emerging writer where I really wrote without any care for the gaze or what anyone thought, and it was just out of this very core urgent emotion. And I think if there's any belief about process, whether it's for ordering stories or writing or revising, I really do think doing what you have to reveal the core driving emotion of what's at stake and why you're telling this story and what you feel above all. I really do believe that. I think that's the key. That's the center.
Well, one of the recurring images in the collection is that of Ganesh, the elephant-headed deity that is the son of Shiva and considered both the removal of obstacles and the patron of learning. So without exception, the protagonists in this book have formidable obstacles. They have to contend with sexual violence or racism or the pressures of parents to conform to age-old traditions, but they rarely, if ever, come across as victims. And so it feels like, in a way, they're operating under the aura of Ganesh, that they're actively engaged in overcoming obstacles. So I was wondering if you could speak to any deliberations that went into how you wanted to portray these women and what you wanted to either avoid or foreground in this, around this question of victimhood, womanhood, and overcoming obstacles.
Well, I think one key obstacle that I started to allude to earlier as well is just the obstacle to even speaking your truth. Often as a woman of color, in situations where there are so many tacit and really in your face explicit discouragements from doing that. And I do feel like when I was younger, like when I was a teenage girl, the discouragement could be more open and blatant. And, boys could say things like, I don't like girls who are smarter than me, which is, I was reminded by this great song that says, if you like girls who are smarter than you, if you've heard that on the radio, recent song. And I think what's really interesting, though, is how that obstacle to speaking your truth, that active discouragement morphs through a woman's life and gets sort of, on the one hand, buried, and people act like they respect you, but then there's a certain internalized censorship that goes on. I think it is interesting that I've had more female than male readers ask me, were you afraid of X person reading your work, whether it was parents, extended family, South Asian aunties, like the gossip keepers of the community and so on. So I think the main obstacle that I find myself often concerned with is often obstacles to self-knowledge and your own acknowledgement of how you feel, as well as the obstacle to just simply stating it and then doing something about it. So it is interesting. Maybe it's a little bit of a feminist reinterpretation of Hindu myth, in that Ganesh is also the god of beginnings. And there are prayers that I know by heart and say, but maybe there is that sense that I know I have in my writing overall of wanting so much to appropriate traditions that have oppressed us, to instead, really empower us. So I think there always are also external obstacles, but I do think we often have so much power than we realize.
So one way you frame the collection is about survivorship, and here's something that you said previously. I am not just writing about survivorship as a sort of condition, but as a form of internal resolution, as one decision or series of decisions, as a form of self-determination, often at great and unexpected cost. Is that what you mean by survivorship when you say about tapping into maybe an unknown sense of power that we don't realize we have, or tell us what you mean by more about survivorship and how it influences the narratives in this collection.
I guess it's a deeply held belief I have that we retain the power of decision, and I guess I believe that in a fundamental way, even to the point where, like the night of Trump's election in 2016, I looked at the glass sliding door to my backyard and very calmly deliberated about how I could reinforce that door in case gangs of neo-Nazis came and tried to smash the glass, a la a Kristallnacht here on American soil, which increasingly does seem like it's happening, in many places. And I found a strange calm in just that decision-making activity. Do I put boards against the door? What if we get rid of the glass door completely? What if we do something to the basement and put an alarm so that we would run down there if someone comes? And it was horrific, but at the same time, there was comfort, and there is always comfort in remembering, what can I do? I can think, I can decide, I can determine.
So one of the ways I think the collection engages with survivorship at the beginning also is structurally. The first two stories are framed stories. They're stories within stories, with characters either telling a story or reading one, so that the act of storytelling is actually foregrounded in the story. And it reminds me of Scheherazade needing to tell stories to stay alive. And I wondered if that was a nod in that direction, a conscious nod in that direction, and if you see storytelling serving that sort of function.
Well, I think the 1001 Nights is so interesting because it illustrates, and I'm a little biased here, the way that the Persian and Urdu cultures appropriated and reimagined so much from the Hindu epics. So there's a beautiful book by Rushdie that he wrote for his son, who was 9 at the time, Harun and the Sea of Stories. And he actually gives a nod to the predecessor of Scheherazade, which is the Kathasarat Sagara, the ocean of rivers, of seas, of stories. So I think the notion of framed stories is very big in the Hindu epics. Like you'll have someone from the Mahabharata, Yudhishthira, being told about other gamblers of the past, because he's a gambler and it's a big problem, through all these stories. And, it's like stories within stories. And you'll be told a story in which someone is telling someone else a story. But it's a little Borgesian after a while, But I think the framed story is something that at its best does not start as an idea, but again goes to a really core emotion. And I think of Maxine Hong Kingston in Woman Warrior, and how she's telling a story in which she's telling how her mother told her both stories and which stories not to tell, not to reveal to others. I feel like her book had a big impact on me. I read that in high school and really thought about what it meant to hold stories as secrets.
So even though we have this nested story structure, and I think you've already answered this, the stories aren't abstract or postmodern. They come from a tradition that's very different, even though it's got this nested story within stories. And if we return to the first story, your autofiction, a woman in her 40s having a miscarriage. And even though she's telling this story as an address to her lost baby, and from the very beginning, she's narrating an experience that's very bodily. We get blood and fetal tissue. It's not elided over, but given to us with some detail. And it feels really contrary to the person who told you not to put it in the book or not to put it first. It feels like a bold and important beginning to me, because it feels like we're going to move through this a collection of embodied people in a bodily way, and mostly in the experience of women in women's bodies. And you've written some nonfiction about the art of description, where you say that the art of description is fundamental to what makes fiction live, the critical element that makes us experience rather than know about a story unfolding. So I'm wanting you maybe to speak a little bit about how you employ description. And I know that's a broad question, but maybe you can talk about it in regards to this story in specific, and why you would employ it in the way that you do.
Well, I think, it calls up a bunch of different threads, and I'll try to be true to each one. I mean, the craft essay that I wrote about the art of description was so inspired by A.S. Byatt's beautiful collection, the Matisse stories, and in particular, the Chinese lobster. And I remember her work also having an unexpected impact on me because personality-wise, she's so sort of Iris Murdochian, kind of, sorry to use the word, arid British lady who's even anti-Harry Potter, so what do I have in common with her? I, who was just reading about Priyanka Chopra with great enjoyment just before but I think she loves the visual, as I do as well, the feast of the visual in writing. And I think it's important that it be coupled with other senses too, or it obviously becomes too static. But I think that there's also this thread in philosophy that I really like from the language philosophers, Gilbert Ryle in particular, who talked a lot about knowing how versus knowing that, and sort of experiential knowledge, to use a clunky kind of term for it. But I definitely think it has so much to do with even how you write something that proves interesting to you and hopefully interesting to others, that, again, it's not evolving out of necessarily thoughts about, it's like a doing. And it's like Deborah Eisenberg said in this beautiful recent interview, my hand starts moving on the page, kind of thing. You're in it. You're in it in order to discover afterward, when you read it critically, to revise it, what it could or couldn't be, quote unquote, about, So I think the other reason that the characters in my book are embodied in that hopefully visceral way is I don't see how you could go through medical training and not embrace that aspect of our reality, to literally have your gloved hands in a human body,
And the vocabulary too that you gain from a medical knowledge.
Yeah. And hopefully, it did take a while. I don't know that I could have written the stories the same way as like a second year med student. I think it helped to practice and kind of know what terms actually convey emotional resonance to me, versus just saying these words because they sound kind of cool or something.
Well, one thing that leapt out in that craft essay was that you mentioned really good dialogue can work like description. And I'd never heard that before. So I didn't know if you had any extra thoughts on that, but I would love to hear them if you did.
Well, I think Zadie Smith's dialogue works like on the level of description as well. Because you are sort of being told about sounds, as well as getting a glimpse into character in an incredibly economical way, in these 5 words that someone says and the 10 words that they leave out. But I think just the sounds of them are sounds of an environment, are sensory details, so are descriptive. And I think that's important. And I thought about that a lot in, for example, a shaker chair, because the words that a psychoanalyst uses, or a psychiatrist, which I am, our words matter a lot. And I don't know that after a while, we don't consciously select the words like, this is what I'm going to say, but we're so exquisitely mindful of our words, because words can heal, and words that are not thought out enough can be ineffective or, God forbid, even harmful.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Chaya Bhuvaneswar about her debut collection of stories, White Dancing Elephants. So one of the ways you use details really well in the collection as a whole is not just with description of what is happening for the main protagonist, but these peripheral details that end up being really, I think, crucial. And I can't imagine the peripheral details not being part of the story because they inform them so much. So some way there's this mystery, and I think the way in which you'll drop in things that provide social or political context but aren't overtly what the story is about. So in the first story, again, we get the protagonist addressing her lost baby, but we also get details like the slurs that are yelled at our brown protagonist, the news of a South Asian woman's body found dead in the river, and the mention of the Diamond Sutra scrolls, Buddhist scrolls that were stolen by a British man and are now housed in a museum in England. And none of these details are really on the surface what the story is about, but they deepen her sense of loss. I think the loss of the scrolls, the anonymous woman's loss of life, and they broaden us into sort of I think a social framework where her life is precarious and devalued. Other stories seem to take this same strategy, even where the focus is elsewhere. And so I guess I wanted to hear more if you had some thoughts about the use of description or detail specifically in this way, which feels like a way to make it beyond individual person's narrative.
Well, I was thinking, I really like wholeness and richness in storytelling, including in short stories. And I was thinking of collections that I've loved recently, and I was thinking of Jamel Brinkley's A Lucky Man in that same way, particularly like stories, say, of two young men going to a party, and there'll be some detail about a movie that year, a song that isn't even playing at the party, but that provided some image that gave them a way to look at somebody. I think that one reason the short story as a form is enjoying, I think, a real resurgence, even commercially. Like, I'm not being told, oh, stories won't sell. I'm really not being told that. I think it's because people as diverse as Alice Munro and Lauren Groff and Nafisa Thompson, have all shown us how you can put a world in a story. And it's my instinct to do that. And I think early on there were other, not teachers of writing, but friends who, much older friends who taught writing to others and just were my, corresponding friend and took pity on me and would write to me about stories. And many times they said, oh, you should make that into a novel. Or they'd write, you have enough here for a novel. And I just really like the idea of seeing if you can formally make it work, to build that world into a story. And one of the blurbs that really meant a great deal to me was from Anthony Mara, who felt that it was formally sophisticated, to be able to do that. And it really resonated that not only he, as, cis-het white male author, whom I greatly admire, said that, as did the Drunken Books podcasters, who they reviewed my book recently, and they said that, and I'm always really heartened by the fact that you would think putting in a whole world would create a sense of, in a reader, a sense of, ooh, I don't know anything about that. But instead, I think the fuller and richer and more telling you can make the details that shape the story, the more they say, oh, I know what that feels like. Mm-hmm. I know what that is.
Well,
I think that's fascinating.
But it also feels like the richness, the specificity, and the complexity work to keep the women from being seen as just victims also, because you get to see all the other things that are going on. This is not the only defining or even the main defining moment of their lives when they're the victim of some form of violence. But you also portray them in complex ways also, in the sense that they are seen perpetuating violence against themselves, against each other as women. So it's not like these stories are necessarily all stories of solidarity. Like, it's way more complex than that.
That is a word that makes me chuckle.
Yeah. So the story where this is taken to the greatest extreme is
I think I know which one
is Talinda. So tell us the premise of this story, and maybe how this took shape for you.
Well, I actually think two stories, not just Talinda, but A Shaker Chair, which ends in this betrayal. I think that theme of betrayal, I do feel like, well, we can only be betrayed in such an undoing, devastating way by people who mean a lot to us, from whom we have expectations. And I know I myself really struggle with that how much do I expect from other women of color? And there's an enormous amount of competition. And some of it's very sad, because it does feel like there's a finite number of slots for a lot of things. And, whoever's hair can be the shiniest, and, whatever it is, And I have heard stories from friends with whom I do have real solidarity, and I'm going to give the first of several name shout outs. Jen Baker, the editor of the beautiful anthology Everyday People, shared with me a story of disappointment, betrayal from a prominent woman of color, and I had experienced something similar. And so I was walking away thinking, what does it mean? But I really think all it means is that we're just as complex as anybody else. And we have our sister friends and we have our nemeses, to use Roxane Gay's wonderful image from Twitter. And I know there are a lot of people who would pay a lot of good money if she just published a book, all blank pages except the first page, listing out her nemeses.
Yeah. I would take a peek at that.
People
book.
would pay. Yeah, definitely. Hint, hint, Roxane. So I really think that on the one hand, there's that complexity of people hate whom they hate and love whom they love. On the other hand, I think in both Talinda and A Shaker Chair, where you get these very intense dyads in Talinda between two childhood, lifelong friends, one South Asian American, one Korean American. The titular character, Talinda, being Korean American, Talinda Kim. And then the other story, A Shaker Chair, being between a Ugandan American psychoanalyst and her Indian American patient. I also think that hostility, betrayal is yet another form of intimacy, actually. And it's a way of being enmeshed. And I know in clinical work, when I listen to stories of people talking about a wish for revenge or a wish to sort of do something to someone, the saying that I learned in my training was, then you might as well put your arms really tight around them and not let go, because it just enmeshes you. And actually the most liberating move really is often to genuinely try to love somebody from a distance, because it's a different kind of love, without the heat in it.
Well, maybe this would be a good time to hear a little bit of the prose from Talinda.
Sure. Talinda. So here I am, sitting in the doctor's waiting room, hoping no one talks to me or intuits why I'm fat, when the door that says on the outside, "Do not enter," swings open, and Talinda storms out, not long for this world. The young blonde nurse stands there, bracing the open door with one hand, holding a clipboard with the other. "We should have the results back any day," she calls, though it's obvious my best friend isn't listening. "Later this week, do check," her voice wafts out, like she's a woman working in a shop, not an announcer of life versus death. Not long for this world. Don't say things like that, I would have pleaded with Talinda if she had said the words out loud, one of her usual angry and dapper turns of phrase. You'll fight this thing, I said, when she first told me she had stomach cancer, and for once she nodded, not ridiculing the cliché. But that was a year ago, before I became this wretched person, a woman sleeping with her best friend's husband, a woman waiting to take over a life. Aren't you full of surprises, Miss Narika Kandalwala? Talinda would have said. You're not as boring as I thought, if she had known. But Talinda herself doesn't know what her husband and I are capable of. Cancer is what she's come to know. How its cells lived as shameless parasites of the body, the dark and mocking children who'd never leave home. Talinda could caution you about genes that whispered false instructions. Genes speaking louder and louder over rivers of gushing new blood vessels, those rivers mindless and cruel as they crossed in confusing directions of their own, greedily serving the cells of destruction. This is Talinda Kim and what she's been given. Age 37, Korean-American, born to a waitress in Flushing, board-certified internist and geriatrician, married, no children, signet cell gastric carcinoma, stage 4, prognosis 6 months. 6 months. If I weren't betraying Talinda, I'd use what I know for her benefit. My arm around her shoulder, I'd describe Audre Lorde's cancer journals, her dignity, her hope. And then Talinda would be forced, as usual, to turn on me with her mix of affection and contempt, the potent and honest combination that I've always counted on. She might say, Narika, you don't win any points for reading some poor woman's private diary whose problems you can't even understand to begin with. It's amazing how you're trying to read books for a living. At some point, you have to stop going to school and get a job. At some point, you have to accept it. The real world isn't made of poetry. I'd urge her on in making fun of me. I'd do anything to distract her, talk about Dadaist art or North Korean politics or Bette Davis movies, her favorites. Now Voyager with a childless Bette Davis trying to make do by being a cool aunt. Of human bondage, Betty as the pregnant, vulgar, coercive, determined Mildred. All about Eve. What it is like to have your life, bit by bit, stolen by a woman you trusted. But all I do instead is slink down in the passenger seat of Talinda's black Benz, hoping she doesn't really notice me. If I loved Talinda, really loved her, I'd tell her that her husband seduced me and vice versa, that the three of us should get far away from each other, that she deserves a better life, friend and lover. If I were good, I'd exit pursued by a bear. My affair with her husband began 6 months ago, well after she'd been diagnosed, after she'd tried to keep working as if nothing were happening, but was fatigued and couldn't stop losing the weight. I gave in after George called me in the middle of the night, crying for me to come help cook something she could eat. After George and I started meeting up in grocery stores, hospital cafeterias, places where we could help Talinda together while she was going through surgery and modified chemo. Tired by marriage, or maybe by his marriage to Talinda specifically, with all its burdens, the heaviest of which was extreme privacy, George pulled me in. The lingering touch on my arm, my back, my hand, the grateful smiles that never felt straightforward. Then his expression when I told him how I'd tried and failed a few times to have a child with donor sperm. I know what it's like to hope and be disappointed, he'd said, to wait and want and not have children, to be the only people waiting in the world. Believe me, I know what it's like. George and Talinda tried a lot too. It wasn't clear now if her in vitro might have speeded up the cancer. She would have kept trying. George was the one who couldn't try again, unable to bear how relentless she had become. They'd just gotten to the point of discussing adoption when her new symptoms started. Then Talinda had to tell George that she'd never make him a father. Today, waiting for Talinda to be done at the clinic, by avoiding certain patterns of thought, by walking fast whenever I passed by mirrors, by keeping in my mind an image of Talinda not loving George, never really loving him. I made it all right that I would be the one having George's baby. Just for a few seconds, I told myself that once I started really showing, I would tell her this was a baby conceived from donor sperm. I'd accept it when she teased me about using the sperm of a white man. But it's possible Talinda will be gone before the birth and never know my baby is half white. We'd have our joy once she was gone, once our Talinda had risen fully out of reach. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. That image from a book the two of us read in high school, from an old story of infidelity and careless, childless adults. By thinking of Talinda as always being high above me, I could sometimes think of her as being untouched by what I had been doing with George, like she had too much pride to be hurt by it, like she had better things to do. But here I was, a little more than 4 months pregnant with a boy, with George's son.
We've been listening to Chaya Bhuvaneswar read from her collection, White Dancing Elephants. So there's a sort of an eternal question that I keep expecting to get tired and retired that seems to be asked more often to women than men. And that's the question of character likability. And when I was looking at other interviews of you, it rears its head multiple times. So I guess I wanted to hear your response. I mean, I don't feel like your characters are unlikable because they're doing despicable things. But when someone points out these things, say a dying best friend, so someone sleeping with a dying best friend's husband, a father who neglects a disabled daughter, and equates these acts and character flaws with quote unquote unlikability, and asks what draws you to this sort of character. How do you respond to that question?
Well, I mean, I do agree with you that there is a burden on women writers in terms of likability, unlikability, and it calls to mind something very interesting that Meg Wolitzer had this op-ed in the Times years ago, like I think like the 90s, about the sort of second shelf, the second shelf occupied by writers who are women who are designated as women writers. And I know writer friends of mine have used the term lady writer in a very contemptuous way, and I'm not completely sure what it means, except if you're scared to write about blood or betrayal, you might be a lady writer. I don't know. I'm not, apparently. But I think it's fair to be outraged on behalf of the characters who are victimized and betrayed. It was very interesting. I had friends of mine read A Shaker Chair, and which was Sam Sachs's favorite one in the Wall Street Journal, which is pretty interesting. And these friends of mine who were women of color as well, said it was sort of painful to read how deeply one woman of color can devastate another, whereas he enjoyed it and said it was pleasantly devious, and compared some of the scheming of these characters to Patricia Highsmith, which I was really complimented by in some ways. So I think it's that there are different points in every human being's life where we can't spare a thought for likability. And I'm really interested in those moments because not only because of the honesty that's involved in sort of showing, okay, what will you do then? Like I actually think, although I love that zombie movie with Brad Pitt, World War Z, I don't think most of us would act the way he does with that incredible nobility and collectedness, even if we had his skills. Like, I think a lot of people going into the scene, he goes into this family's apartment, they let him and his family in, and he encourages them to move with them and try to escape together. But that actually creates more peril for his own family, because then the zombies bite them and they become zombies, try to attack his family. I actually think most people would go in there knowing that to survive you move, and deliberately not tell those people that, so that there'd be more resources for them in their own family. I believe that.
Well, I think you're right that most of your characters are at a moment when they can't give a concern to how they appear or how likable they are, because they have other more pressing concerns than likability. But one of my favorite characters has a different scenario, and that's maybe my favorite character is the biracial Black therapist, who she's worried that she's being racist towards her Indian client. She thinks this Indian woman smells, and yet she's also drawn to her and unsettled by her in a way that is charged and maybe even mysterious to her. And I love this tension between the racism the therapist experiences inside, and then also her desire to provide a service and keep a professional demeanor, because she has a self-awareness of what's happening inside of her. She's not trying to be likable, but she is trying to be professional against her impulses, essentially. So I was hoping maybe you could read a couple paragraphs about her therapist philosophy for us, and then I want to ask you a question.
You can't become a therapist by being nice, Sylvia would have said, if she were still 16 or 22 and not age 47, and therefore past debating with her mother. But Mother's empathy rankled. Fine to have empathy if you didn't have patients seeking to devour you. Fine to have kindness if you couldn't be ruined. Any decent therapist knew that being too empathic got in the way of being a therapist. You couldn't be soft. You had to fend for yourself. Sylvia had wasted enough time earlier in her career on rumination and compassion for difficult patients. In her ridiculously detailed care for others, she had missed out on her own life. Acknowledged or not, in psychoanalysis there usually was the smell of blood. People were brutal when exposed and vulnerable. People could hurt, especially when they were trying to take from the therapist what their own parents had not given them. They'd strike out if you didn't watch. Keeping up your guard while smiling warmly, that was the ticket.
I love that. And I love how that sort of completely subverts the general public's notion of what a therapist might be doing or thinking. And I also imagine as a psychiatrist yourself, that must have been a really particularly delightful story to write. But I guess I wanted to know, I don't know if you do therapy in your practice, but I wanted to know if you, your own thoughts with regards to the perils of empathy, if there's any ways in which your own thoughts intersect with this character's thoughts.
Well, I really appreciated writing an essay for Medium several months ago, Behind the White Coat, and I have another essay coming out in Long Reads precisely about this sort of calibration of mindset as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, who actually I do mostly more acutely ill patient care, which I find very meaningful. But there's always a psychodynamic therapy component to, I would argue, any doc, like the primary care doc in a small town who's just sitting and listening to somebody, how do you calibrate actually doing that work versus writing subversive things about characters, some of whom do some kind of health-related work? And I think for me, the boundary is what makes it so sustaining and nurturing, truly, because I think I am freer on the page to kind of cackle with glee at people doing terrible things, because I know that there's such structure and care in what I do as a job, and there's a sacredness. There truly is a sacredness to it, in that I'd never put any kind of actual clinical scenario that I'm thinking about or talking about with colleagues or reading about in an academic way into any kind of a fiction. And this story was actually really inspired by thinking a lot about Idi Amin in Uganda and what it had meant for him to target Indians in Uganda and call us roaches, want us out, really instill and uncover this belief that a group of people are the problem. And I wrote this story before Trump, but revised it since, had to do the revision since a little bit. And I'm sure some of that dread and deep sadness worked its way into it. That what does it mean when you're a person of conscience, a progressive person like Sylvia is, with her Buddhist sittings and, but on some level has reactions to people who belong to that group that she learned from her Ugandan father.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that detail was so great. And another way we were talking about earlier about these details that are dropped in that feel like they're peripheral, but ultimately feel like that it's impossible that they couldn't be there. And in this case, I love the detail that, so you inform us about the history of the expelling of Indians from Uganda, but also that American Black nationalists were supportive of the expulsion of Indians from Uganda because they really worshipped Idi Amin.
Yes.
And so that's an interesting thing that takes this very interpersonal relationship, Black therapist, Indian client, and makes the biases something more than personal, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it becomes like the acting out of something collective.
And I think so much of what we do is that. And for me, that's helped me find both some level of hope and hopefully some empathy, for people who are wearing those MAGA hats, which now my friends and I have a joke that say, make a-holes get arraigned is what MAGA shouldn't. But anyway.
I like that.
But, they have a context. And it was interesting reading some of the fiction by military recent active duty, like Phil Clay's beautiful Redeployment. I think there's a sense of a lot of different white subcultures in this country who had been feeling silenced and unheard, and not necessarily the subcultures described in, things like Hillbilly Elegy, which there are alternate books that describe that demographic and economic situation that I would recommend above that one. But I think there's something fundamentally not chosen by at least in at least part of how we view and interact with the world. I do believe that. So then in the question, what do we do with it? How do we then evolve a way to interact with other people that's really loving? I think that remains a challenge.
You mentioned a couple pieces you wrote about your medical practice, and I wanted to read a couple quotes from them and then ask you a question in relationship to this. So you said, I learned in medical school and residency that so much of being a doctor, even with no patients in the room, would involve obeying a repressive code. We'd be expected to be as neutral as possible so nothing would impede the machinery of care that depends on us yet dominates our lives. We'd be expected to nod silently, always, rather than launching impassioned defenses of any idea that might get in the way of the reality of the patient's needs before us, of the system's demand that we simply perform. And then you also have said, a doctor's friendly, watchful, generous silence is one instance of self-effacement among many. Another involves keeping your voice and face free of outrage. This, no matter how egregious others' microaggressions can be, especially for a woman of color in medicine. This, no matter how many times and by how many different authority figures we might have been promised that such transgressions, such racist or sexist or intersectional indignities would not happen again. This, no matter how much we might have invested in ideas such as quote unquote equality. This is how the system protects itself. And I don't know if you want to add more to that sentiment, but I did think about the tension of this therapist and then the tension that you hold in creating a place of self-effacement for your patients, even if you are ultimately being the recipient of racism or sexism or some other micro or macroaggression on you at the same time, how that there must be some satisfaction, I would imagine, in allowing some of those thoughts free in your fiction and allowing this character, this therapist, to have the thoughts and to go into the interiority and to like expand upon them in a way that you might not be able to expand upon them in real life in the moment. But I don't know if I'm being presumptuous, but I want to hear more about that.
Well, I think medicine has evolved. You know, medicine has changed in the last couple of decades, including psychiatry. And I think of, in particular, a beloved supervisor who was a very revered analyst who would deliberately teach trainees to have a mental image of an axe that he would encourage them to imagine was hanging by the door. And then when certain patients said really outrageous things, you know, like, you're a doctor, how come you're fat? Or, you know, when was the last time you brushed your teeth? Or, you know, something really like you're sitting there and you have to take it, you know, and you kind of smile and nod and say, let's think about why that's coming up for you right now. You know, he would encourage his trainees to literally take the axe in their minds after the patient had left the room and do whatever with it in their minds. You know, I think that's hilarious. And that sort of analyst, you know, at you know, the traditional Boston hospitals, you know, they trained Sylvia. So one of the things I wanted to try to communicate is how in all the professions, and I think we see this, you know, even in popular culture like Scandal, you know, the Kerry Washington character, there's an older white male who's constitutive of how we think and operate in some fundamental way. Like, she looks different, I look different than them, but they made us, actually. You know, so these older white male, almost invariably straight supervisors who are terrified about Me Too now and think back to all the things they said and all the things they did and shake, you know, they made us too. And they gave us something. And I really hope those traditions can live. But at the same time, medicine has changed in the sense that there are therapies that have evolved where, you know, like dialectical behavioral therapy developed by a woman psychologist, Marsha Linehan, written about in the Times, where you learn in the therapy to be transparent in a certain way with your patients. And the act of transparency removes any need for those kind of axe fantasies. So you can just say as one human to another, listen, I value our work together so much, but what happens when you page me 6 times in an evening over a 2-hour period is that I get 2 hours late to give dinner to my kids, and then it becomes harder for me to think about sustaining this long term. And I'd like to be with you for years and decades. I really want to be there for you. And this is how it's actually obstructing me from doing that. So you're revealing, I have kids, I have a life, but not in a way that places a burden, right? You're just saying, as one human to another, let's work something out. So when you page me, I really know it's a signal of urgency. And there are these 10 other things you can do when you're just bored. You know, so I definitely think medicine has changed and been enriched by more diverse practitioners. On the other hand, I think that what will never change and what I hope never change is something called patient-centeredness, that it is the beauty of medicine that no matter who you are or what you believe or what you've done, you get you get to be counted first when you're in the room with a doctor who's supposed to take care of you. Mm-hmm. You are number one. You're not number one in the sense of the customer always being right, which is what insurance companies are trying to make it for us, which I really dislike. You're number one on a spiritual level. And when I'm a patient with my doctor, I get to be number one, and I think I'm part of a vanguard of women of color, physicians and allies and others who particularly feel that it's important for marginalized people to feel that in the room, because one of the reasons there's been so much historic distrust and superstition, ranging from vaccine refusal to conspiracy theories about HIV, which still have made it an active problem and not just a chronic illness in minority communities, is the fact that for years, really before the 1980s, let's say, there were many, many egregious examples of marginalized patients, poor patients, patients of color, not really being treated like number one. People who did Medicaid fraud, exploiting these patients, lying about treating, like all kinds of horrors within medicine. So I don't blame them for being suspicious, but that means a great deal to me, where I'm, at least for some period of time in a room with a patient, wherever that room is, they can be number one and know that I mean it, because of what I believe, not because of, it's not personal, but it's not impersonal,
Yeah. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your wealth of knowledge in medicine as it comes to your writing is that we also get people who are ill or are struggling with a disability or some other aspect going on in the story. It's not about that, but that happens to be part of their existence. And so it becomes a crucial detail that informs character without necessarily the story being an illness narrative. But I was curious about writer doctors, and there's a long lineage, obviously, Chekhov, Bulgakov, William Carlos Williams, and then there are wonderful contemporary literary medical nonfiction writers like Siddhartha Mukherjee and Atul Gawande, and I wondered if there were any in particular that influence you in your writing.
Well, I've loved all those folks that you mentioned. I feel like I'm a little controversial in that, yes, there are many moments of misogyny and problematic ways of looking at people in Patterson, but I still love William Carlos Williams completely. Really love him. Love his sensibility and imagism, and I think Atul Gawande was very brave in the honesty of his writings on medical error and kind of grappling with those things. And I can't even imagine most residents, most trainees writing the way he did when he was writing these New Yorker essays and he was still a surgery resident. That was very brave. And he's been very kind as a writer also in Boston. But I think one writer I feel like who isn't mentioned enough, who is a writer-doctor with a lot of humanitarian accomplishments, is Nawal El-Saadawi, Women at Zero, and an activist against female genital mutilation. She's really a model in many ways because on the one hand, she's writing from her own personal emotions and history, which is what I always want my writing to be about. It's not that I'm number one in that everything's autofiction, because it's absolutely not. It's not interesting to do that to me. It's more all the characters reflect preoccupations, reactions, emotions that I've had just as a person, independent of any kind of professional identity. And she, Women at Zero is about traditional Egyptian society and what that was like for a woman who became a doctor when there were very few women doctors. On the other hand, her activism to prevent traumatization among women who are being forced to undergo FGM has been so much a part of how she construes being a psychiatrist. That look at the psychological damage you're doing to people, look at what you're doing and making people look at something in a certain way, speaking with the authority of her training. I think that's really ideal, and there's a beautiful documentary about her that I encourage people to look at.
I'm glad you mentioned a woman because I was noticing that most of the writer doctors that are mentioned, if not all, that are often mentioned are exclusively men. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be the case?
Well, I mean, some of the thoughts I have are kind of sad, thinking that they just don't see us. Like in general, women writers in the room are just often unseen. And Lauren Groff, who was so generous as to blurb my collection, has written and spoken so eloquently about this, that somebody raising their hand and talking about, well, how do you manage writing with your parenting skills, kind of already assumes that you're not the great man writer for whom a path must be cleared so that your genius can come to light,
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I also love the way Ayelet Waldman, who's also been wonderful. I interviewed her for a local magazine, has really parsed the expectations of mothers, writers, and said there are likability expectations there too. But I think, some of it's logistics too, that it is really hard. It is really hard. And I think another person who I really admire is Perry Klass. She has been a practicing pediatrician for a really long time. Before that, I think she did some graduate school in cell biology and wrote a delicious book called Recombinations, which I encourage everyone to pick up. It's a slim novel, very racy, about people in a lab recombining, very racy.
I love that idea.
And like old, I picked it up in the med school library, like, what's this? And I was like, but I think, I just think it's because it's hard, but also because it's women writers. And like even the buy the book lists that Lauren points out, why aren't there more women on those lists?
Right.
It's all over the place.
Well, tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned an uncle who had artist aspirations, but also was struggling with some psychiatric issues. And there's a way in which that was influential for you. I think it may be even in a career way, I'm not sure, but also enters your writing. So tell us a little bit about this aspect of your family. As you mentioned, you like stories that mine the personal, not necessarily literally, but in this
Right.
case, perhaps literally. What was going on with your uncle, and how did that impress something on you?
I think like any family secret or family shame is always a wound that writers look at and, try to understand and kind of often walk around, So I feel like a lot of really amazing stories start from something you find out happened in your family that no one talks about. And so really for a long time, no one talked about the fact that this uncle who is well at times and impaired at other times, certainly not ever functioning in terms of having a job outside, had what's called first episode psychosis when he was fairly young, like in his mid-20s. And in my mother's family of sort of self-identified academic achievers and, lots of doctors and a diplomat and a zoologist. And, it was, I think what really moved me about his plight as I myself struggled to think, what am I going to do in the world? Who am I going to be? Was this idea of being made to feel like a failure, not because you actually are, but because you can't run with a certain pack. It's like in high school track team, I had to find the pack of girls who I could train with, who were better than me and then I was better at them sometimes, but not so much better than me that I was left running by myself, So I always wondered what it would have been like. Because there are studies that show that, the majority of Iowa writing program students have a first or second degree relative with bipolar disorder. And so who they're thought to have some of the traits of bipolar disorder, but they're celebrated for their function. Or like Catherine Harrison, the writer whose work is beautiful, I think, is open about her bulimia. Esme Wagen Wong is a great example of a woman who, thank God, was able to really create art precisely from that place of mystery of what is my place in the world, given that I do hear voices sometimes, and what we're going to get to read about in the collected schizophrenias, which I can't wait for.
I can't wait.
But I always wonder about that the tragedies, or at least what feel like tragedies, because the person is suffering a lot, that are artificial and maybe man-made and circumstantial, and did it have to be that way? And I think and pray that a lot of times, no, they didn't have to be that way. And even though all of us are vulnerable, and there are fires in California right now, and who knows what's happening with the sun, and a lot of bad things are happening that we can't control, I do really feel like just having a level of acceptance for neurodiversity, other forms of difference. I really appreciated the NPR reviewer said difference beats at the heart of this collection. If we can honor that, can there be less suffering and take away some of the tragedy?
Well, maybe this is a weird segue, but if we take this idea of difference, and maybe this is similar to the question of likability and likability, but you said that a certain type of story about immigration between India and the United States has taken up all the oxygen in the room, that the immigration story has been co-opted by readers looking for curry, quote unquote, looking for curry. And I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I am imagining it's a very simplified form of difference, or there's not a lot of diversity or of representation within looking, quote unquote, looking for curry stories. But what is a looking for curry story, and how are you either not writing one or subverting the idea of one?
Well, I love, I have to give credit to Naben Ruthnam, who really kind of brought to the fore this idea of the curry narrative. And I think Jenny Butt is a wonderful essayist who deliberately tried for her Pop Matters feature, including my book and the work of 4 other story writers, books that deviated from that narrative. So I will say that the way I construe that sort of curry narrative is a little bit of what a lot of South Asian writers, I think, had been encouraged to do writing in the diaspora before Jhumpa Lahiri, who changed that narrative in beautiful ways and complicated it to the point where you get the lowland and her engagement with Italian culture and language and kind of her FU to don't tell me what to write about, But I think before then, the way it went was one of a couple possibilities, like somebody's trying to avoid an arranged marriage, and dating an American boy is wrong for them to do because the parents said no. And then there's conflict. And then either the parents accept it eventually, or in, I think, the more interesting version of the curry narrative, somebody gets beheaded, like Death of a Princess. But
Wow.
those don't sell. There's some kind of very simplified view of intergenerational conflict that oversimplifies most egregiously, in my mind, the empathy the capacity for empathy and understanding of the older generation. And I thought Mira Nair is actually really good at subverting that. There's this moment in an early movie of hers, Bhaji on the beach. Bhaji refers to like a fried kind of savory dish. And like they're eating it on the beach in this sort of field trip of South Asian women to Brighton Beach in the UK. And there's this woman who is being beaten by a really good looking and on paper perfect romantic hero type of husband, the kind that white women say, oh, he's so handsome, you're so lucky. And this kind of Omar Sharif kind of guy is really a monster. He's really a monster. And this beautiful woman is wearing all this clothing to hide the bruises and stuff. And there's this granny. I love her. I wish she acted in more movies, period. One of these women who's easy to caricature as, oh, she'll be shocked by anything you say or do. And she and her older friends see the bruises. And they're the ones who tell her, kick him to the curb, and they're the ones who say, get out of here, to him. And I'm trying to remember. I think they even get violent and they try to say, get out, don't do this. So I think that's the fundamental flaw of a kind of Curry narrative that says in order to have freedom, you not only have to be in America or be in the UK, be in Europe, but you have to adopt your new country as your new family because you can't find empathy, understanding, or complexity in your family of origin because they're old world. And so that's where I think Jhumpa Lahiri does such a beautiful job in her first collection with a very empathic portrayal of that quote-unquote older generation. And then in the second collection, which I adore, Unaccustomed Earth, doing an even better job, I think, with richer, longer stories. And then I think that's what it is. I think any sort of predetermined narrative that tries to force you into oversimplified characterizations, that's just really limiting and demeaning to you as a writer, I think.
Well, I want to ask you about a characterization of your work in the LA Times. They look at your book through the lens of choice, saying that the women in White Dancing Elephants are reckoning with the decisions, missteps, fears, and compulsions that have brought them to their current juncture, and that you're entering a time-honored tradition in Indian American literature around choice. Writers in India and the Indian diaspora who play with the tension between the Western myth of quote-unquote free will and the traditional Indian constraints of family and community. And then the article quotes Gogol, who said, the reader should realize himself that it could not have happened otherwise. And that's the epigram at the beginning of one of Jhumpa Lahiri's books. So the Times places you in this tradition, saying you update it for a contemporary America. And I wondered, does this characterization of your work being placed in a specific vein of Indian and Indian American literature, does that ring true to you? And if not, why not?
It's always kind of a double-edged thing, because you're really grateful to be with a tradition of writers that frankly have been published, have been read, have been widely praised. So you feel like, I'm not going to be surprised if, no one has said readers of Jhumpa Lahiri will just love da-da-da. And I'm glad we have progressed. And now people say readers of Kelly Link or Carmen Machado will love da-da-da. So I love that. That's great. I like being grouped with other women. And I do think what I appreciated, the way I read the LA Times review as well, is looking at feminism in terms of choices that women make and, women kind of stumbling over choices, making some choices, having to live with consequences. Like the Kyrgyz review talked about its aftermath. You're dealing with this aftermath. I think that's universal enough. So I think that is that was on my mind, I'm sure, you know. And then I think in terms of my relationship to other South Asian writers, I guess the way I feel now is I'll take it as long as it doesn't constrain me. So I've been asked by South Asian interviewers more than once, were you scared to write about that? Or were you worried so-and-so would read it? And I enjoy really now saying, no, not at all. You know, I really could care. No, I care for them to read it if it's going to be enjoyable to them. But if it's not, then I mean, I haven't gotten negatives. So I also think that it's very funny, but I think there are many South Asians who are in tech and professional jobs who had dreams, artistic dreams. And I actually think I get much more of that, of like, how do you have a day job and write, you know? And I think that's lovely. And I admire them for coming forward that way.
Well, you've written about, coming back to this question of choice, you've written about how your parents had you committed to an arranged marriage, that you characterize it as the institution you felt locked into as a teenager, and that the main way you escaped it was through imagination and through the imaginary boyfriends. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about navigating that, and maybe some of the what were your imagined boyfriends like, for instance?
Well, I really appreciated Luna magazine publishing a version of that essay, which I thought a lot about in terms of Salman Rushdie's beautiful collection, Imaginary Homelands, where he talks about what it was like to go back and see his family's pre-partition house in Bombay, and also that sense of national loss, you know. So I think for me, imaginary boyfriends were so much about a reminder that someone can tell you, yes, this will be your destiny. When it's the right time, a boy will be picked. And I appreciate, actually, that my parents were open about it, you know, more open than many people's parents, that they said it has to be an Iyer, which is a particular kind of South Indian Brahmin community, because this is what we believe, you know, and it's sort of like, I have Jewish friends who said that their parents said similar things like, we will die out. We will die out as a tribe. You know, please don't forsake the project of trying to continue the tribe. Almost like a tribe going extinct in the Amazon, you know, like I was like, is that like that? You know, but the imaginary boyfriends, you know, and it was very hard to actually coalesce anybody into like a real, it's not like All the Boys I've Loved Before, where she sort of has imaginary attachments to real people. Like these were actually imagined people,
they were completely
you know,
fictional.
like completely like an archetype, like the bohemian, you know, and there would be people I would know who would fit some aspect of that, but I'd actually be quite skeptical. Like, are you really like that? So I think that, I think arranged marriage it's still so alive. I think that's the thing to really point out. It's so durable, and I don't know why. Really, I think it's fascinating, but it's quite durable and has survived long into India's tech revolution. And Priyanka Chopra is actually going to bring Bumble, this dating app, into India. But what I predict is that people would post profiles saying, wheat skin Kshatriya boy seeks same, you know, from a girl raised in a family with at least one professional parent or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it'll be semi-arranged. So I think it must be that there's some kind of tribalism that endures and people want to perpetuate. And I wouldn't judge it, you know, but at the same time, it was liberating for me to not do that. And I'm very grateful that I wasn't beheaded for not doing that, you know. Like,
Well, possibly the most heartbreaking story for me was the final story, which was a queer couple, and one of the Indian woman in the couple leaves her girlfriend to go to India to fulfill her parents' wishes for her arranged marriage. I would imagine that you're drawing on some of your own angst growing up with that tension and demand upon you. But could you talk a little bit more about the final story in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate again that that's a story about two queer women, and there's no white male in sight in that story, and yet several have told me that they like that story. So I'm so grateful, for that resonance. But I think that story, what I really enjoyed is the juxtaposition of Hindu comic books, which actually Jeff Vandermeer connected with me because of that, because he has a huge collection apparently of Amar Chitras, and that was so formative to me. And so diaspora South Asian kids grow up reading these illustrated renditions of stories from the epics that are really good looking comic books with people with big muscles and weapons and jumping and no boobs, unfortunately. But, so I think, juxtaposing Hindu comic books with the Song of Solomon, which is one of my favorite poems, read as a poem as well as devotional. But that said, again, it's partly, at least through imagination, that Nisha, the Indian woman character, tries to escape her fate. And I do think that idea of destiny and fate being something that presses upon you and you're trying to escape and trying to make terms. I don't think the LA Times reviewer was wrong in terms of feeling that was there in the story collection, because I certainly grappled with it.
You studied Sanskrit and Hindu epics at Oxford. Tell us a little bit about that on its own regard, but also tell us a little bit about it in regards to how it is in conversation with your own narratives. Do you borrow plot or specific interactions that happen in the epics and can make them contemporary?
Well, in the story collection, the epics are sort of all over the place in this, like the story of the woman who fell in love with death is a really changed version of the Savitri story, which is, I'm going to get it wrong. It's either from Mahabharata or Ramayana. Please forgive me, for not knowing. So I'm not going to say which one, but she bargains. She tries to bargain with Yama, the god of death, to save her husband. So I thought, for me, an inversion of that story was, what if she had fallen in love with the god of death, But I think that, for better or worse, the epics are so much part of my imagination, and so is Sanskrit lyric poetry. And I studied it only because every single week in temple and every few days and for every festival, Sanskrit was part of the life of my household. We had a puja room, and I can now use the word puja, P-U-J-A, because Priyanka and Nick had a puja according to Harper's Bazaar. So now that is in Harper's Bazaar, that they had a puja for their wedding, and it's in English now, like the word pakka. It's pretty awesome. So I think again, as writers, we to mine the material that really grips us, there's no getting away from what sort of shaped us and what made us. So they're definitely there. But I'm also glad you brought it up, because the novel that is hopefully going to go out on submission in a few months definitely, again, mines Kalidasa and other Sanskrit poets, but in the very sort of brash talking voice of a contemporary South Asian American young woman. So I hope that, again, those traditions that shape us, I hope they can live with who we are now. Whether it's medicine, whether it's those old epic literary traditions. It's meaningful to me, for example, that, popular culture like Showtime's Billions borrows from Richard III, which I wrote about, and which the creators, Brian Koppelman and others, wrote back to me saying, that is true. Like what you're noticing there, we did that on purpose.
Huh. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, if we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning about stories within stories, and also you in your real life, having to come up with stories of imagined fictional boyfriends in order to escape some real life
I really hope my spouse is
demands.
not listening to this.
Well, you were 13.
You were the
right?
main one.
Right. Well, I also think about your story, Chronicle of a Marriage Foretold. So this woman gets to go on a writing retreat on an island, and this island used to have both men and women on it, but there was some previous history of sexual harassment by men. So the island became an island where women could retreat as only women onto the island and write uninterrupted by men. But the irony of the whole thing is she invents a male character in her story who in a way sort of harasses her imagination. So like she's on this woman only island. She's in her retreat keeps getting interrupted over and over in this form of literary harassment.
He's a heckler.
From her own mind.
Yes.
Right. So, but you also have this, speaking of sort of like toxic imagination, you also have this nonfiction piece called Hot Asian Babes that looks at the way we sort of reiterate the politics out in the world in our own imaginations. And in this case, you're looking at what you call colonial porn. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about this piece, what prompted it, and also just tell us about colonial porn.
I'm so grateful, that Lydia Kiesling, whose own novel, The Golden State, is so magnificent, by the way, a 5 under 35 awardee. She's the editor of The Millions, who took that essay really without any edits, and it was an essay that for me was an act of reclamation, because there was sort of all these ideas that I jotted down fragments of in notebooks while going through medical training. And I had this thought in my mind before I got sort of now really into my novel that I was going to have to systematically go through this and write every single one. And this one really stayed with me because of that moment of shock, being in an Oxford news candy kind of shop, because it was at some point, it's sort of funny and sort of sad. At some point, as arranged marriage drew closer and closer, Oxford was really where, it was going to be that it happened, during the second year. I devised this scheme to save my stipend. And so I started living on candy from Oxford shops, candy and crisps, and those were really cheap, and saving the rest of it. And it put me in more contact with the townies, because I'd go hang out in the library because that was free and so on. And this woman saw me looking at this magazine, Hot Asian Babes, which is was a real porno magazine, very popular in Britain. And I was just staring at it because I'd never imagined that there was ethnic porn of that kind, although it turns out there's plenty of ethnic porn all over the place, as anyone who has an internet knows. So I, and she took my shock as an opportunity to heckle me, to say, cheap, aren't they? Like, what do you possibly say to that, right? I mean, you want me to insult other South Asian women? You want me to get offended that maybe you're calling me cheap, because I was called that in my 20s at Oxford, walking around in, what I thought were really cute outfits. And it was, I guess, they really were not revealing at all, but just to be visible as a woman of color in those very white spaces, just to wear leggings under my robes for an exam. And the tutor, this white man who harassed a lot of people, said something about it, just so I think that, I think it was really important for me to write that piece because it had been there for so long and needed to come out. And it's an example, too, of really trusting to what your hand does on the page, because I vividly remember being at McDowell and locking myself into one of those little cubicles that people know about in the library and coming out with that piece written and not intending to write it that night and just kind of writing it. So, one of the fascinating facts about that essay is that the top consumer of that porn was white British men.
Wow. Which isn't, is that surprising?
I
I mean,
don't
in a weird way, I
know.
don't
I
know if it
guess.
is.
I
I
mean,
don't
I
know.
guess on some level, maybe it's not because it's sort of like the unknown and the other, and that's how I get to have it. To me, it was surprising because of the level of visceral disdain and disgust that I met with growing up about my body, and just the darkness of it, the imagined smell of it, just all of me, all of the group of South Asians that I knew had experiences like that, even if it was just bringing your lunch to school one day, like Jhumpa Lahiri talks about the self-consciousness of, chutney staining the Wonder Bread and, oh, your sandwich looks green, you're different. So I think that's why it surprised me that it taught me something about how layered disdain or contempt really is.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to jump into the story Orange Popsicle, which is sort of a college Kavanaugh-like gang rape situation.
Yeah.
But what is most notable about the story is the response of the quote-unquote victim, which is not what I think most people would expect. And this has a resonance with incidents that you've actually witnessed in your own life. And I was hoping maybe you could talk to us about the real life events behind the story, and then in the story considerations of how you wanted to portray both the incident and the aftermath response to the incident.
Well, I think one thing, rereading that story recently, which was written, so it was written in much earlier form, like maybe at the end of my residency. And then I took it out again, revising it before the Kavanaugh hearings, and then read it at an event after. So just looking at it different time points. I think this idea of extreme vulnerability induced by not following the rules and not being a model minority was pretty interesting to me. And Vanessa Hua does something I found out later really beautiful with that idea in Deceit and Other Possibilities, where she has this student who is an imposter, Stanford student, or, like just lies, and people believe it partly because of Asian model minority stereotypes, so that was interesting. And similarly, this poor woman, Jayanti, she's only in this class that devolves into a cheating scandal because of this stereotype that being from India, she must be good at science, even though she's a talented visual artist and has no scientific background to speak of, So the stereotype confounds her that way, even to be in a vulnerability situation. And then it confounds her again, with this American guy making a big deal about how delicate she is, how exotic and delicate she is. And those statements were made to me as an undergrad. I remember them vividly. I remember I went through this phase freshman year where people who are listening to this from Yale will remember it too, because I was like one of the few people who did this. I decided to wear traditional Indian clothes. I decided to wear salwar kameezes a lot. And I had gone through this very glamorous transformation from being very overtly nerdy in high school to suddenly realizing Vogue and glamour and doing stuff. So it was a big deal, and people made a big deal about it. And then the backlash, which I didn't expect, was this hot Asian babes kind of objectification, which it sounds like an abstract word, but it's very immediate. What it means is people stare at you and say scary things that are scary to hear when you're walking alone at night. So I conveyed that sense of danger in the story. And then unfortunately, there was a gang rape at Yale that a South Asian woman experienced. And there were horrible accusatory posters put up by white sororities saying she was lying, saying she was trying to destroy the careers of innocent young men. And then a professor of mine whom I really love, who is a cis het white male, one of those giving us traditions kind of. I think I can actually say his name because it was in the papers. He was the head of the committee that looked into it. His name's Jonathan Lear. He's actually now at the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago. He made sure the right things were done, and he did not absolve the men who did this. And the woman in question was able to move on, I think. But a lot of the story was created by the space of my allowing her that privacy, where I don't actually know exactly how she moved on. The rumor is that she actually moved back to South Asia and became a soap opera actress, which I think is amazing, and I'd love to write that story. But I think that the other thing that informed it was Maya Lin being really honored as a Yale graduate for both the Vietnam War Memorial, but also a commemorative sculpture that she created for the anniversary of women at Yale. And just seeing for the first time, going there, the possibility of being a woman of color artist, that was very, very meaningful. And I know someone I met again at McDowell and knew slightly at Yale, Susan Choi. She has been inspiring that way as well,
Well, I don't know about the woman and the real life woman, but the character in Orange Popsicles sort of, I don't know if it's defiantly, but she remains visible afterwards. She still dresses in glamorous ways and is out in the world sort of demanding attention and respect and being seen. It's very prominent in the story. And I'm imagining maybe you're imagining into some of that based on what you experienced.
And it's my hope.
Yeah.
But I think I actually had a really lovely correspondence once with Roxane Gay after I read Hunger and realized for the first time how much internal kind of covering can happen after incidents like that. And I did it too. There were periods where after experiencing sexual harassment, I decided I was going to eat more. I was going to try to gain weight. I was going to wear different clothes. I was going to do things that obscured. And I think she talks about that in Hunger after the rape, the rape that she experienced, which was also a gang rape. And I think that it's so important to reclaim the right to present yourself truly as you choose, whether that's in a tuxedo, whether that's, after an experience like that, because the having an experience like that invites you, coerces you into believing that it's something you did by your presentation, it's something you brought into your life.
One of the things that I wanted to explore from a craft perspective around this story is you could have written a story about a gang rape and a woman's sort of defiant a refusal to disappear afterwards without including any of the stuff around the cheating scandal. But I feel like there's something, and maybe this goes back to our initial discussion around peripheral details and the way marginal things can inform the whole. But she's involved in a cheating scandal. She's implicated along with her future rapist, who sort of uses it as leverage. And by being involved in a cheating scandal, we learn that she's on a provisional student visa. So she's not an American and she could be deported, that her life there is very precarious other than just being a woman of color. But that she's also grappling with having done something wrong, which is also happening while she's being wronged in a far worse way. I don't know if I have a question here, but I guess I'm interested in that juxtaposition of making her obviously not culpable in any way around the sexual violence, but she's dealing with culpability around other things that she's chosen simultaneously, which doesn't allow us to settle entirely into categories of good, bad, or good evil, or even though obviously evil is happening in the story as well.
Well, some of it was just the the mechanics of how would they enter each other's worlds, and how would they enter each other's worlds in an intimate way that made it that much harder for her to have her guard up from the beginning and just not even make eye contact with him. He caught her at a vulnerable point where she was looking for an escape from a high pressure situation where she thought she was going to fail the next day. So some of it, I guess, was a little bit a story, telling a story. But I think probably that idea of, being marred by something, like whether it's cheating or in this other story, Newberry, the character Vinita does some crooked things, even though she uses them in that story, hopefully to ends that other people agree is noble, which is trying to save her very sweet, dreamy poet boyfriend from being deported. I do think that we need and deserve to have that complexity as people of color. I think that's a little clunky, and I'm not meaning it in terms of identity politics. It's more like someone saying, don't make it so that to be willing to hear our stories, we have to be less than human on the page. Don't make it that we have to be fundamentally different and better to be worth being heard.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we finish, I would love to give you an opportunity to talk about all the various other things coming down the pike for you as a writer. I'm kind of blown away. Second story collection, a novel, possibly a poetry collection, and also an anthology. Would you talk about any or all of those?
Sure. I mean, I think I got a chance that I really valued at Duwende District in DC to talk about, well, how do you do that? How do you get involved in more than one project at a time, let alone, try to write seriously and have a day job? And I think so much of it really comes down to details and God being in the details. So each thing kind of parsed out. I am very grateful to have been pretty well published this year and last year as a poet. One of my poems is Pushcart nominated by Sid Rial, which has published Maggie Smith and other poets I love. And then another poem received a prize in the Joy Harjo contest from Cutthroat. And I feel like I've learned so much from poets I've interviewed for Adroit Journal, including Victoria Chang, who gave a very generous blurb for this book as well. And hopefully another interview I'm doing with Patricia Spears Jones, whom I recommend everyone go out and read. She just got a major prize from Poets and Writers. So it's something I'd been working on for a while. It exists, and whether or not to publish it as a chapbook, I think I'd like to try. My agent says, no, just write more poems and publish it as a full book. But I think having a community and being part of a poetry community, and the friends I have who are poets whose work I love, like Roy Guzman or Rajiv Mohabir, who I interviewed recently as well, they really have given me something that has fed my fiction as well. I think it's really valuable to have poetry in your life, and I can't say enough good about what people call the renaissance of interest in poetry, and Fatima Asghar's beautiful collection selling out in Target, and Danae Smith winning that major prize, or Jericho Brown being in this week's New York Times Magazine. These are poets I adore. So that exists, and there's no timeline on that. And then similarly, Flames Under Our Skin is kind of either going to be just a web anthology or a piece that Elle magazine is interested in having some writer women of color friends and I kind of put together. So then it may end up being a smaller project. And then the second story collection is a set of linked stories, some of which have been published in Joyland and elsewhere, on this interracial marriage between an Indian American physician and her white eco-conservationist husband. And I got really interested in this idea of, on the one hand, someone trying to do good, like trying to save the Everglades and so on, but really not seeing how he himself internalized so many attitudes that are problematic and kind of controlling and not really healthy. So, but it's a marriage that evolves over time. And I'm just interested in writing about marriage in general and just living with someone for a long time and what that's like. There's a beautiful memoir coming out by Rima Zaman, whom I read with here, on the opposite of that, the disillusion of a marriage, the realization of an absence. And she had this phrase last night about the habits, growing into each other's habits as part of the joy of marriage. But then I also think in terms of, is it different when it's an interracial marriage where both sides are so conscious of their difference? How does that then affect the ability to ever settle home? And then finally, the novel. So I actually wrote this novel right when I finished residency, and it's gone through many permutations. People who know me will say, wasn't that supposed to come out in, and I'll say, yes, it was. And we leave it at that. So, I think what's nice about having another job that I'm really committed to is that I could afford to write things and cook them for a pretty long time. And now with publishing this story collection, feel more empowered to start sending stuff out. But this literally was a bunch of manuscripts in a drawer that, for no other purpose than just enjoyment of craft, I would take out and work on every night and not expect much, and not have to be like, I have to sell this or I can't pay rent.
But it sounds like it could be the decade of Chaya Bhuvaneswar.
Oh, right.
Coming up. It was great. It was great having you on the show today.
Better that than the decade of Trump is what I'll say to that.
For sure. We've been talking today to writer Chaya Bhuvaneswar about her debut collection from Dzanc, White Dancing Elephants. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Chaya Bhuvaneswar's work can be found at chayabhuvaneswar.com. I've also uploaded a poem and a conversation about singing and a song by Chaya Bhuvaneswar to the bonus archive. This joins bonus material by Carmen Maria Machado, Therese Marie Myatt, Sheila Hetty, Layli Long Soldier, Forrest Gander, John Keane, Jen Bervin, and others. All of this can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.